Penny had been in bed for over an hour that night, staring at the shadows cast by the dim moonlight when she first heard the music. It was so quiet at first that she couldn't tell where it was coming from, but as it grew stronger, the strange realization came to her that the music was coming from outside her bedroom. She got out of bed cautiously and shuffled over to the window, where she saw a group of 5 musicians gathered on the lawn. 2 guitarists, a bassist, and a clarinetist playing an uneven, out-of-tune version of Elvis's hit, I Can't Help Falling in Love with You. She half expected her friends to pull some kind of pre-wedding prank and laughed, opening the window to chase the band away. But as she poked her head out into the night air, she heard some movement to her right. She turned and in the dim light could make out the figure of Kenny sitting cross-legged on the roof above the porch, just a little farther from the window. He smiled broadly and began humming the words of the song along with the orchestra. Penny froze in place, seemingly unable to move or speak, listening with her mouth open to Kenny's surprise declaration of love when she heard her father call out to her through the bedroom door. "Hey, Penny, what's that noise? Is something going on in there?" Penny recoiled from the window and shouted through the door. "No, Dad, it's just a prank. Some guys playing music on the lawn, that's all." "Well, the hell with them. It's past midnight, damn it. I'll go over there and chase them away." The realization that her father might see Kenny on the roof threw her into a panic, so she stuck her head back out the window and told him to hide. "Where?" he asked, spreading his arms in a questioning gesture. Seeing no reasonable place to hide, and realizing that the path to the lawn was winding enough that he would surely be on it the moment his father opened the front door, Penny turned to Kenny, gritted her teeth and headed toward her bedroom, hissing softly, "Hurry, come here, hurry up!" Kenny eagerly responded and smiled, climbing through the window and closing it softly behind him before turning to face Penny. "Hi, Penny. Funny to meet you here," he said with aplomb. She tried to keep a stern, disgruntled, indignant expression on her face, but his greeting completely disarmed her and she could only laugh before sitting down on the bed and shaking her head. "God, Kenny, you're going to get me in so much trouble." Kenny nonchalantly reclined beside her, still smiling, leaned back against the headboard of the bed, and clasped his hands behind his head. "With an angel face like that, you can get out of any kind of trouble, baby. Any kind of trouble. You're such an asshole, Kenny." "I wouldn't say that, baby. You know I mean it." He nodded his head and raised his eyebrows, then his eyes caught the pendant around her neck and he gestured at it. You're wearing... you're wearing an opal." Penny lifted it with her hand and looked down, then returned her gaze to Kenny. Yes, yes, I am wearing it. It's a very sweet gesture. A lovely gesture for a friend, Kenny. Thank you. Thank you very much." "Is that what we are, Pen? Friends? Because I actually feel differently about you. What I said last night, I meant it." "I love you, Penny," he said in a hoarse, choking voice. "I love you too." Next chapter. When Penny awoke, she was greeted by the soft snoring of Kenny Bailey lying on his side, and her mother's voice coming through the doorway. "Penny, honey, it's time for you to get up, dear. It's getting late." Penny, in a sudden panic, slapped Kenny's shoulder several times to wake him up, and then quickly covered his mouth with her hands as he spoke, gesturing frantically toward the bedroom door in her mother's voice. "Penny, did you hear me?" Yes, Mom, I'll be right out." "Honey, I have your dress here. Let me take it and put it on your bed so you can put it on when you're ready." "Wait, wait, Mom," practically screamed Penny, jumping up from the bed. "Don't come in. I have, I, I have really bad gas. I think, don't." Her mother's voice took on an incredulous tinge as she started to open the door. "What? Don't be silly. I'll just come in, put the dress on your bed and—" "No, Mama!" screamed Penny, slamming her shoulder on the door to prevent it from opening fully, and then coming face to face with her stunned mother, who was still standing in the hallway, blocking the way into the bedroom of her clearly disturbed daughter, who seemed to be mumbling something incoherently. "Seriously, Mom, it's just really bad here, really bad. I can barely stand it myself and, well, it's just so weirdly awkward. You know, and I'm going to go downstairs now and I can put my dress on there." During her incoherent monologue, Penny glanced back and forth at Kenny, who was silently rummaging around the room, gathering his shirt and underwear but unable to find his pants. Penny angrily ordered him to leave, and eventually Kenny opened the window and practically jumped out through it, leaping from the roof onto the lawn below, fleeing the house and the neighborhood. During his escape, Penny managed to maintain a strange conversation, constantly referring to the relatively toxic atmosphere she had created in her bedroom, essentially forcing her mother to stay in the hallway until she was sure Kenny had safely left the room. At that moment, the tone of her voice changed, and she opened the door abruptly, inviting her mother in. "Okay, Mom, if you insist, you can come in, but I warned you." She briskly strode across the room to close the window and, noticing Kenny's pants by the dressing table, discreetly shoved them under the bed. Meanwhile, her completely confused mother slowly crept into the room and sniffed the air gingerly before allowing herself to take a deep breath. "Penny, I don't know what you're talking about. It smells wonderful in here." Penny smiled nervously at her mother. "Really? I think it smells awful. It must be the nervous tension from the wedding day." "Yes, yes, I suppose so," said the mother with uncertain concern. Next chapter. Penny sat in a stiff, upholstered, straight-back chair in the preparation room adjacent to the chapel. Her immaculate wedding dress flowed around her in perfect white waves. Her hair was arranged in elegant, romantic ringlets. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was staring blankly out the window. At that moment, she heard the sound of the door opening and the quiet sound of footsteps on the carpet. "Please, please, I'd like to be alone for a few minutes," Penny stated, without checking to see who had entered. And then her mother's voice reached her, soft and gentle, loving and kind. "It's me, Penny." Mrs. Miller sat quietly in the chair across from her and stared intently at her daughter, her face reflecting pain and sympathy. In her hands, she held Kenny's neatly folded jeans and his wallet. "Pen, honey," she said, taking the jeans in her hands. "I found them under your bed. Do you, do you want to talk about it?" Penny stared at them dumbly for a while, then burst into tears. Oh my God, Mom, what am I going to do? I don't know what to do." Penny's mom put her jeans on the floor, pulled her chair closer to Penny, and took both of her hands, gazing intently into her face as she spoke. "Penny, honey, what do you want, sweetheart? Who do you want? Because that's all that matters. I, it's hard for me to say what I want. I feel like I'm at war with myself, Mom. When I'm with Jason, everything feels right. Everything about him is so perfect. But Kenny has taken over my heart and I can't let him go." Penny bit her lip, her worried expression darkening even more, and fresh tears drew new paths on her makeup. I, "Mom, this is just going to kill Jason. How do I do this?" Mrs. Miller reached up and brushed a tear from Penny's cheek, looking at her daughter with love and concern. "Well, honey, I don't know exactly what to tell you, but I know you can do it. And whatever happens, know that you have my support and my love, and my blessing, if it matters." Next chapter. Jason Bright stood in the groom's preparation room, barely overcoming his excitement to stand still while Brian Hewitt meticulously adjusted his tuxedo, brushed off his lint, adjusted his tie, and made sure the groom was absolutely flawless. While Brian was adjusting his tie, Mrs. Miller and Penny entered the room, and Jason's face broke into a wide, excited smile, which immediately turned into a mask of concern when he saw the distraught expression on Penny's face, accentuated by red eyes and tracks of tears. "Penny, what's wrong, honey? Are you okay?" He stepped away from Brian and took 2 steps toward Penny, intending to hug her, but Penny stopped his movement with a raised hand. "Jason, Jason, we need to talk," she said simply as Mrs. Miller gestured for Brian to follow her out of the room. "Of course, honey. Of course. Tell me, what's wrong?" Penny shook her head slightly and turned away from Jason, fresh tears appearing in her eyes. Without averting her gaze, she spoke again, quietly, hesitantly, in a voice full of pain and regret. "Jason, I have bad news, very bad news, and I don't know exactly how—" "Honey, whatever it is, it's going to be okay," Jason started to say, taking a step forward. But Penny raised her hand again and moved her gaze straight to him, now looking him straight in the eye. "Please, Jason, let me finish, because this really isn't going to be good." Penny swallowed hard twice, looked away, then back at Jason before starting again. "Jason, I can't marry you. I'm sorry, I love you and I know you love me, but I just can't do it." Her voice was devoid of emotion and became almost robotic, as if it was the only way she could get her point across without breaking down. Jason shook his head and feigned a smile that should have been reassuring, but the fear and vulnerability behind it only made his heart ache more. Penny, honey, if you're getting cold feet, I understand. We can, we can put this off. We can take our time and Penny shook her head violently, hot tears streaming down her face, which had taken on a determined expression. No, Jason, no. I can't marry you now. I can't marry you ever. It would be a mistake for both of us. I can't be your wife, Jason. I just can't. I'm so sorry. Jason spread his hands in a pleading gesture and took another step forward. But Penny, he started to say, but she only sobbed, took off her wedding ring and held it out to Jason with a trembling hand. And then, gasping in pain, she turned away from him abruptly and stumbled out of the room, tripping over her dress. Next chapter. John Bright was standing in the foyer of the church, not far from the chapel, when the pandemonium began. He saw Penny's mother come out of one of the preparation rooms with Brian Hute and say something serious, her somber face not in keeping with what he expected to see from the mother of the bride on her wedding day. While she was talking, a few women managed to sneak up and overhear their conversation until they apparently caught the gist of it, at which point they began thrashing around the church to start a chain reaction of gossip. Soon, both men and women were animatedly discussing what was going on, tugging on the sleeve of any passerby to elicit more information. By this time, Brian's conversation with Mrs. Miller was almost over and had become downright unpleasant. Brian blushed, his nostrils flared as he gave Penny's mother his firm, final opinion, and then turned and headed back to the groom's room. John took a few quick steps toward him. Hey, Brian, what's going on? Brian looked at John and shook his head in disgust. It's canceled, he said firmly. The wedding is off. Wait, what? That can't be, John replied, heading with Brian to the ready room. But all his doubts about the veracity of Brian's information were dispelled when he saw his son leave the room with misery on his face. His tuxedo was disheveled, his previously perfectly combed hair was a mess, and his eyes were wet with tears. Oh my God, son. Son, what happened? Jason could only stare at his father and shake his head, rendered speechless by the devastating news his ex-fiancée had just given him. At that moment, Kenny Bailey burst into the church without coat or tie, half-dressed in his suit pants and unbuttoned white shirt, and demanded the attention of the first muscular woman in an overly formal dress who caught his eye. Where is she? The woman nodded excitedly toward the archway leading to the reception hall, and Kenny, realizing this, hurried in the same direction. John watched the scene, squinting his eyes, looking back at Brian, who had a look of disgust on his face, then at Jason, who still looked dazed and incoherent, and at the archway through which Kenny had disappeared. John's face flushed, and he began clenching and unclenching his fists, pushing his way through the crowd toward the reception hall until he reached the hall itself. There, amidst a crowd of happy, chattering spectators, Kenny knelt down in front of Penny, who, still in her wedding dress, sat in a straight-back chair and nodded happily through dried tears as Kenny held her hands and spoke to her with a broad, reassuring smile. Shaking with overwhelming rage, John cast a long, angry glance at the couple and exploded. What is this shit? Those words caught the attention of the entire crowd, who as one turned and looked at John with surprise and disgust, but their disapproval didn't faze John. You mean to tell me that my son's heart is broken because of this loser? He gestured at Kenny, an incredulous expression on his face. Penny began to cry again, and Kenny, gritting his teeth, began to rise, while off to the side, Penny's father quickly made his way through the crowd to John. Look, I'm asking all of you who seem to be taking such pleasure while my son bloody eats his heart out. I'm asking you if it's true that this bitch— As soon as the word bitch left John's mouth, Penny's father unclenched his fist and the blow came like lightning to the corner of John's mouth, causing him to stagger and take a step back. John wiped his mouth with his hand, then turned his attention back to Penny's father, a murderous expression in his eyes and his mouth set in a grim, bloody smile. Clenching his fists, he strode toward Mr. Miller, who, clearly surprised that his punch had no effect on John, began to back away awkwardly. But just as John came within striking distance, Jason's voice, tired but firm and insistent, stopped him. Dad, no, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. None of this is worth it. John looked at his suffering son, and the rage on his face faded away, leaving only a look of calm understanding. Brian walked over, put his arm around John, and they began to make their way through the crowd toward the church exit, with the guests flanking them. But Jason paused for a moment, looking around the hushed crowd before he stopped his gaze on Penny, agonized anticipation written all over her face. He reached into his pocket and with a smooth motion tossed the wedding ring toward Penny. It hit the tiled floor with a loud clink and bounced twice before falling next to her foot. "Goodbye, Penny," he said with bitter finality, and then walked out of the room like a man condemned to death. The next chapter. 1,000 days. Jason sat hunched over in front of the coffee table in the small living room of his apartment, chewing the last bit of cereal and staring blankly out the window at the coming dawn. He stood up slowly and stretched, then walked across the living room floor past the chair where she usually read, past the closet where her clothes were kept, and entered the kitchen where she was cooking and dumped the empty bowl into the sink. 1,000 days, he muttered, looking at the empty bed piled with crumpled sheets, evidence of another night spent alone, bad dreams, and insomnia. He took off his workout clothes, showered and shaved, then dressed in his usual dark conservative suit, tied his tie, turned his back to his reflection in the mirror, and walked out of his lonely apartment to work. 1,000 cursed days, he said aloud, walking across the garage to his car and remembering another, far more harrowing walk. That day, after leaving the church, he had essentially staggered to his car, barely managing to get there with the help of his father and Brian. The ride home was almost unbearable. His father insisted on driving and spoke to him in the most soothing tone a grouchy, exhausted man could have, trying his best to convince Jason that the world went on and that life would eventually get better. His father stayed with him for a week while Jason tried to come back to life, first in an almost catatonic state, then incoherent, and finally in a state of sluggish depression. 1,000 days, and this is still the best part of my day. Sighing, he pulled into the Prairie Tower parking garage and nonchalantly took the elevator to the 42nd floor. He made his way to his corner office, nodded to the janitors, the only people on the floor at this time, and then sat down at his desk and turned on his computer. This place was a refuge for him, a corner office where the intellectual appeal of numbers, graphs, and models could seduce and occupy his mind enough to chase away the memories that tormented him. All memories were tormented by memories of betrayal, of tearful confessions, of the gold ring jingling against the tiles to rest on the hem of his wedding dress. At the urging of friends, he sometimes tried to tread on dangerous ground. In particular, he had 5 dates with 5 different women. All of the dates had been awkward, with forced smiles and sporadic awkward conversations, and none of them had been so successful that either party had even considered trying again. They all ended pretty early, even without a kiss on the cheek. After the 5th date, about 6 months later, Jason came to the conclusion that he wasn't ready to socialize with women at all, let alone date, and decided to go private again. And so he sat in his sanctuary, his office, his inviolate space that protected him from socializing with others, from the pain and hassle of human interaction, and from the dangers of creating relationships. It was the only place where he felt comfortable, where the idea of utility replaced companionship. But at the end of each day, the workday was over, and Jason had to go home to the TV, the computer, the books, and the empty, cold, lifeless apartment. And he was slowly realizing that he couldn't lead the life of a high-tech hermit indefinitely, and that even for him, some minimal socializing was necessary. So that night, instead of going straight home, he decided to do something different, to try to go to the social party Brian had urged him to attend with an enthusiasm that bordered on coercion. Leaning back in his office chair and folding his hands on the back of his head, Jason worried about the discomfort he would feel this evening, and for a moment thought about brushing it off. But, pursing his lips, he discreetly shook his head with a look of determination on his face and stood up to grab his car keys. Next chapter. The house was large, almost a mansion, located on a street lined with other mansions. There were cars everywhere, filling the driveway, parked on both sides of the street, and 2 even parked neatly on the lawn. Jason put the car in a small spot a block or so away from the house and texted Brian his arrival, slowly making his way through the parked cars. When he reached the front door, Brian had already stepped out to meet him, smiling broadly and shuffling nervously from foot to foot as Jason approached. To keep him from turning and running, Brian put his arm around Jason's shoulders and quickly pulled him inside. Despite its size, the house was crowded with people. They crowded around, laughing, watching a baseball game, playing volleyball in the backyard, eating barbecue and drinking beer. Brian took Jason from room to room, showing him off to old friends and introducing him to new acquaintances at a brisk pace, the men greeting him with cheers and patting him on the back, the women smiling flirtatiously and making small talk. To his surprise, Jason was enjoying himself, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt something akin to confidence when talking to women. After wandering around the house and sampling the food and entertainment, Jason and Brian settled down to a game of pool in the large rec room. When Brian left to get a beer, Jason felt comfortable enough to wander around the house some more. Eventually, he made his way to the media room where he ran into Buddy Johnson, a pleasant, chubby former classmate who had found a temporary shelter next to a table littered with potato chips and juice. Buddy smiled broadly at Jason. "Hey, Jason. Haven't seen you in a while. What's up, buddy? Want some chips? There's a barbecue outside, too." No, I'm fine already." Jason smiled back and then nodded at the big TV, which was currently running a commercial. "What are you watching?" Buddy swallowed and ran his tongue over his lips before answering. "Huh. Yeah, we just finished watching the Cubbies lose in extra innings." Buddy rolled his eyes in disgust, then continued. "But it just got switched to some movie. When it's over, I think they'll hook up the Xbox to play. I think it's almost finished, so it won't take long if you want to play." Jason nodded in response to Buddy's words and stood behind the couch littered with people as the movie started again. Jason nodded in recognition, bit his lip and began to rub his hands restlessly, recognizing the plot. It was the end of the movie The Graduate, and he watched as Benjamin Braddock, Dustin Hoffman's character, abandoned his car, which had no gasoline, and set off on foot to frantically make his way to the wedding. When he arrived, he found the doors to the church locked and eventually made his way to the glass wall at the back of the chapel. Jason swallowed hard twice and began breathing rapidly through his nose as he watched Braddock knock on the glass and call out to Elaine over and over to get her attention, and then turned pale as a sheet when Elaine turned in response to Braddock's words and, spotting him, abruptly left the chapel in a burst of chaos and fled with Braddock on a bus, leaving her fiancé behind. The informal audience, which included not only those seated on the sofa but also several couples sprawled on the floor, were clearly amused by these scenes. Two of the men, who had been drinking heavily, began shouting "Elaine, Elaine" as the scene played out, while the others laughed and giggled. Jason, however, found himself bent over with his hands folded in his lap, as if his head was suddenly foggy or even nauseous. One of the women passing by to grab a bite to eat delicately placed a hand on his back and gently asked if he was okay. He stood up, embarrassed, and looked around at everyone gathered who were so enthralled by the idea of a woman leaving a man at the altar for someone who was clearly offering more. He looked at the woman, a short, olive-skinned Hispanic woman, with a concerned, uncertain smile, shook his head, and without a word, walked out the door. Next chapter. Brian walked with bated breath to Jason's apartment door and stood in front of it for a minute or more before he raised his hand to knock. When nothing happened, he knocked a second time, louder and more insistently. This time there was a shuffling sound, and then the door opened and a tired and disheveled Jason Bright, dressed in shorts and an old t-shirt, stood before him. Hi, Brian, what do you need?" he asked, opening the door wide, silently inviting him in, and then turning and heading back into the living room. Brian hesitated for a moment and then followed him, turning to Jason. "Hey, I'm sorry to barge in on you like this, but when I call, I only get voicemail and I wanted to talk. I just wanted to say I'm sorry about the party last week with the whole movie thing and everything. You didn't have to come over to apologize. It wasn't your fault. In fact, it wasn't anyone's fault." "Yeah, that's true. But I was worried about you and I wanted to make sure you were okay. And I guess I wanted to talk and get it to you that, that, "What?" Jason asked tiredly, sinking down onto the couch. Brian sat on the edge of the couch, folding his arms across his chest, and thought about his friend for a moment before answering. "You've got to move forward, Jace. You've had a rough patch, but you have to get out of it and live your life." "Oh shit, Brian. It's easy to give advice like that, but damn, I got stabbed in the back by the person I should have trusted the most in my life. It was the most painful and humiliating thing I've ever gone through, all thanks to the woman I was in love with. How the hell do you move on after something like that? Do you have any idea what that feels like? Any idea?" Brian raised both hands as if trying to stop Jason's words and his pain with a simple, firm gesture. Just stop, Jason. Just stop. You're right. I've never had to go through anything even remotely like the emotional blow that Penny dealt you. I understand that. But as a friend who cares about you, I'm saying that you can get over it if you want to, but it's going to take some effort and some courage. Jason snorted in disgust. So I'm some kind of coward now because I got dumped? Is that true? Brian shook his head in despair. Come on. You know that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that how your life turns out is largely up to you. You can stay isolated and alone, trapped in this apartment like some character from Great Expectations, or you can at least try to start something new. Jason sat up, his face clenched in an expression of frustrated anger, his mouth opening and closing in an attempt to respond. But there were no words, and then, as if exhausted by his own emotions, he collapsed back onto the couch. Damn it, Brian. I don't even know how to start. I can't even figure out what to do. Brian smirked, pulling a folded piece of paper out of his pocket. Well, Jace, Brian might have an answer for you. He unfolded the paper and placed it on Jason's knee. Jason took the paper suspiciously and studied it, his eyes frowning as he read. Brian, it's just a list of girls. A list of girls who would like to go out with you. Names and numbers, all the information. All you have to do is call. I've done it before, but it didn't work out. Well, it's time to do better. I don't think I can. That's what I thought you were going to say. Brian pulled out his cell phone and flipped through several screens. Here, I've been ordered to read this to you if you resist, so listen. Brian pressed a button on his cell phone and John Bright's voice rang out in the room. Jason, no one knows better than me that you're in a worse situation than the latrine at Woodstock with all this marriage crap. And I understand why you've become disillusioned with life in general and women in particular. I do. But honestly, son, it's time to grab life by the balls and start living again. I've seen you do some amazing things, and now I'm asking, or maybe insisting, that you do another amazing thing. I want you to put all this crap behind you and start having fun. Smiling Brian has a list of girls he assures me are top-notch. I'm not sure if Brian has more than 3 working brain cells, but I will say this. He seems to know a thing or two about women. So in this case, and this case only, I want you to do what he says. You don't need to get involved in anything serious. Play the field, have fun, put your past in the past. You have too much ahead of you to live in a self-imposed prison. Jason sat on the couch with his arms folded across his chest and rocked slowly back and forth, staring dumbly at the list he had placed in front of him on the coffee table. So? Brian asked after a few moments of awkward silence. What? Jason turned to Brian, his eyes blinking as if he had just woken up from the bright light shining in his face. Brian let out an intermittent sigh. You're going to pick yourself up, ask one of these girls out, and try to start a life. Jason started to nod his head. Yeah, he interrupted him abruptly. Or are you just going to continue this slow social suicide like this? Brian waited with his hands folded on his hips, and Jason watched with a strangely amused expression as Brian's aggressive, defiant attitude was replaced by incredulous surprise. Wait, what did you say? You said that you were going to ask some of these girls out? Is that what you said? Yeah, that's exactly what I said. Jason's voice grew sharply stronger and more convincing. My father is right. You're right. I have to live my life. I have to move forward. Brian's entire torso rocked back and forth in a nodding motion, and he opened his arms in a welcoming gesture, his eyebrows rising in a surprised look. All right, then, he said. Next chapter. With no rational way to decide who to start with, Jason started at the top of the list. The first woman was the roommate of one of the girls Brian had dated. She moved like a ballerina, tall, slender, and graceful, and her gorgeous straight brown hair fell over her shoulders like a silk garment. She had graduated from college 4 years ago, worked as a buyer at a local clothing store, and had a passion for tennis. They had dinner at a formal Italian restaurant and then went to a play. She was polite and cheerful, but the conversation was awkward and became increasingly drawn out and tense as the evening progressed. When the play was over, Jason drove her home without any objection on her part. He ended the evening with a dry kiss on the cheek and an apology. Jason spent the night tossing and turning in bed, thinking about the night before. He swore out loud through clenched teeth, arguing with himself about the futility of socializing. But the next morning he grimly went to the list and called girl number 2. She was short and perky. a pale-skinned, freckled, red-headed girl who could strike up a conversation with a statue. She worked at the veterinary clinic as an assistant, liked to dance and skate. They went to a sandwich store, then a dance club, and ended the evening with coffee at a late-night diner. The evening passed easily for Jason as the conversation flowed quickly and incoherently, discussing everything from the sorry state of the space program to the relative superiority of Labrador retrievers and their preferred style of snowboarding attire. They seemed to talk about everything and everyone except their personal romantic stories, and Jason later realized that this was almost certainly an explicit directive from Brian. Over the next 2 months, he asked her out 4 more times: a night at the ballet, a night at the movies, another night of dancing, and then a picnic in the park. He loved being with her and she enjoyed his company, but she was an energetic girl with a busy schedule, and there was no real spark between them. So he slowly let the relationship fade, calling and texting her but not asking her out again. Girl Hash 3 was a free spirit. She weighed a few pounds, had light brown hair gathered in a ponytail, laughing brown eyes, and tanned skin. She worked as a research assistant in the physics department at Northwestern University, but on weekends and one night a week, she partied hard. She loved motorcycles, loud music, and smoking pot. Jason invited her to a rock concert. After the date was over, she invited him inside, and after a little hesitation, he accepted. The apartment was filled with the sounds of the Grateful Dead and the thick, acrid, sweet smell of smoke. Her roommate, tall and thin with a joint between her lips, waved from the kitchen where she was obviously baking brownies. Jason made himself comfortable on the couch, declined the bowl of grass, and tried to act casual until he finally gave up and went home. At his apartment, he quickly took off his clothes, put them in the washing machine, and took a shower himself, vaguely wondering if he might have tested positive for secondhand smoke. The next day, he called Girl Hash 4. She was something of a Marilyn Monroe clone, with short, curled, platinum blonde hair, full and blood-red lipstick lips. She worked as a saleswoman, still lived at home, and didn't seem to have any real interests. Jason, whose ability to communicate was slowly returning, struck up a conversation with her as they sat down to a long and rather tedious dinner. He drove her home, and she invited him out for a drink, informing him that her parents were away for the weekend. But Jason couldn't bring himself to enter into any kind of relationship with such a weak girl, so he politely declined and went home, where he finished the evening with a bottle of baby oil in front of his computer. Girls 5 through 7 were cute, outgoing, fun, but otherwise unremarkable. He enjoyed getting to know them, having pleasant conversations, enjoying laughter and easy intimacy. He made second, third, and even fourth dates, but never felt anything but pleasant satisfaction, and began to worry that the relationship he had with Penny would forever slip away from him. He began to think that maybe he would have to find someone he was comfortable with, or maybe he would just fall in love, and that a love as deep as the one he had with Penny was simply not meant to be repeated. But that's the way it was, until Girl Hash 8 came along. Gail Ann Rawson was a 28-year-old University of Illinois graduate with a degree in marketing and a solid advertising job at a downtown department store. To most observers, she was, if not beautiful, at least pretty. Shoulder-length ash blonde hair framing a heart-shaped face, cool, lightly freckled skin, and a soft, comfortable body. She was also the only girl on the list that neither Jason nor Brian had ever met. Her brother worked alongside Brian, and when he heard about Jason, he called his sister over to his place. Brian took one look at her picture and put her on the list. When Jason called, Gail was wary and a little reserved, even surprised that Jason had called her specifically. She vaguely remembered talking to her brother about Jason a few months ago, but now, faced with the reality of a date invitation from a complete stranger, she'd chickened out and declined, and Jason, feeling somewhat relieved that he wouldn't have to try to impress a complete stranger, had taken it calmly. But a couple of days later, Gail called back and apologized for her refusal, explaining that she hadn't wanted to at first, and after talking to her brother again, she'd changed her mind about going on the date. They talked for a few minutes on the phone, joked about how blind dates can be uncomfortable, and arranged a lunch date later in the week. They met at a small downtown cafe specializing in soups and salads. The conversation was awkward at first. Typical opening remarks, job and education descriptions, general information about family life, and idle comments about soup and bisque preferences. Gradually, the conversation became lighter, more casual and spontaneous. They swapped stories, talked about interests, and laughed. When they finished eating and Jason held out his credit card, he looked at his watch and was surprised to see that he was 30 minutes late for his return to the office. He hastily paid and led Gail out to the sidewalk where he hailed a cab for her and then caught his own. Next chapter. Back in the office, he absent-mindedly went about his day's business, reflecting on his lunch with Gail. Following his plan to not seem needy or overly concerned about any of the girls he had a good time with, Jason decided to wait a couple days before contacting Gail again. After a few hours, he decided that he wanted to invite her to a play that was coming to town in a couple weeks, and figured he'd better call her the next day so she'd have a chance to book the date. By late afternoon, he changed that plan and decided to call her later to invite her to dinner that weekend. He ended up calling before he even left work and invited her the next night. She said yes. They had dinner at an upscale steakhouse, planning to go to a movie, but time slipped away from them as they chatted all through dinner and missed the start of the movie. They lingered at the table, devoured the shared dessert for over an hour, and continued to chat after paying the check until the waiter began to gently hint and then more insistently suggested they move the conversation elsewhere if they were done eating since the restaurant could use that table. Gail was shocked, but Jason only laughed and, instead of ending the evening, suggested they move their date to a nearby bar. They continued to talk about everything in the world, from clothing preferences to favorite sports teams to travel dreams. They talked about the important things seriously and the humorous ones lightly and with interest, revealing any minor fact about themselves. One day, the conversation turned to the excessive lifestyles of the rich and famous. Jason reasoned that money and fame likely exacerbated the problems associated with poor lifestyle choices and listed a few famous people. When he mentioned Lindsay Lohan, Gail snorted and rolled her eyes in disgust. God, Lindsay Lohan, how much I hate her. She said it, almost spitting the words out. Jason raised his eyebrows and shook his head puzzled. Why does she annoy you so much? I mean, I know she's out of control and beating herself up, but what makes her different from the rest of us? Gail took a deep breath, bit her lip, and looked up at the ceiling before returning her gaze to Jason. It's not that she's using anything. In fact, I don't care about that at all. It's just that she was in a Disney movie that I just hate, and for some reason I can't help but blame it on her personally. Wait, you hate her because she was in a movie you didn't like? Gail squinted her eyes and wrinkled her nose as the conversation took a decidedly unpleasant turn. No, well, sort of. I mean, I really hated that movie. Jason tilted his head to the side, thinking about Gail for a moment. Seriously, you owe me an explanation. How can a movie, and even a Disney movie, be so bad? Gail exhaled in a long, controlled sigh and leaned forward, resting her elbow on the table and resting her cheek against the palm of her hand. You're going to make me talk about it, aren't you? She smiled. Yes, he replied with a half-smile. Yeah, I guess so. Gail took another deep breath and exhaled slowly before speaking again. Okay, well, the movie is a remake. The Parent Trap. The original starred Hayley Mills in it. Do you know the story? Yeah, of course, I think I do. Twin girls find out they're sisters and try to get their mom and dad to get back together, right? Well, yeah. And the horrible things they did to the girl who was going to marry their dad. Jason raised his eyebrows and Gail leaned back in her chair, chewing on her lip as if contemplating what to say next. She moved awkwardly in her chair and smiled embarrassedly at Jason. Everyone liked that movie because everyone wanted the parents to get back together. And no one liked the girl, the platinum blonde he was engaged to. So everything they did with her was supposed to be really funny, but, 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 here's the thing. I really relate to this girl. She just fell in love with a guy and tried to marry him, and these girls are playing all these horrible tricks on her to separate her from her father. I know the movie makes her look like a gold-digging bitch, but she's just... Wait, so why do you care? You really don't know, do you? A look of undisguised surprise appeared on Gail's face, and Jason realized he'd missed something important about her past. He shrugged, shook his head, and smiled, calmly answering her question. No, I have no idea. Gail pursed her lips and ran a hand through her hair, pausing to rub her scalp before continuing. I guess I thought you knew about my story. I figured Brian or my brother told you and that they were trying to set me up with a nice guy or something. Honestly, Gail, I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, at least you know about me being with Trevor, right? I've mentioned him a couple times, haven't I? Well, of course. Jason nodded his head. I got the impression that things were pretty serious between you two. Well, yeah, it was. Gail paused to clear her throat. Anyway, he was an older man. I think I've mentioned this before. He was in his late 40s. An architect, divorced. So we started dating. It was very serious, and we talked about marriage, but he had a daughter, Amy. She was 14 at the time, and she really had a thing for me. Why? She really wanted her parents to get back together. The divorce was hard on her, and I think she never got over the fact that the breakup was final. So when Trevor and I started having a serious relationship, I think she decided that if she was going to get in the way of our relationship, her mom and dad would still have a chance. And she threw a tantrum? Gail took a sip of her drink and shook her head, but a small, embarrassed smile continued to play on her lips. No, she did the parent trap thing, lots of shenanigans, to make me look bad or bitchy. Shenanigans? Yeah. Jason looked at Gail expectantly. Oh, now you're going to make me tell you about the pranks, aren't you? Jason smiled openly, nodding his head, and Gail let out a short, snorting laugh and shook her head, as if she couldn't believe what she was about to do. Good, then buckle up. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly before beginning her story. The first prank I know of happened the night I was going to meet his business associates. I lost my favorite perfume, and Amy came running with it just as Trevor and I were pulling away from the driveway. I didn't have time to apply them before we pulled up to the restaurant, but it turns out she had added some horrible smelling stuff to the perfume, like raw sewage. I didn't even realize it was me until Trevor sniffed my neck and almost released the gag as soon as we entered the restaurant. I wanted to go home and clean myself up, but it was too late, so I went to the restroom and cleaned myself up as best I could, but I still think I stank to high heaven. It was horrible. Every time someone came near me, they looked like they had just swallowed curdled milk. Oh my God, that's awful, Jason said, barely suppressing a laugh. Yeah, I just sympathize, she said with a sarcastic smile. But that was just the beginning. Before our next date, she washed my underwear in the same shit and added some to my Sprinter. She also put a few garlic capsules in my vitamins, which resulted in horrible breath, as you can guess. I told Trevor what she did, but he remained silent. Honestly, I was beginning to wonder if he thought I just smelled bad. Jason leaned forward and defiantly inhaled deeply through his nose. Well, I'm not picking up anything right now, but I'll take another sniff outside, see if the odors here are masking it. Funny. She faked a frown and a smile, then continued her story. And another time she somehow got hold of fly pheromone and smeared it on me before a picnic with our friends. Not a few minutes later, I was already swarming with little black bugs. You can imagine the impression I made as a fly lady. I was furious and asked Trevor to talk to Amy, but he just let it go. And that ruined our relationship? Almost, but not quite. It stressed me out, made me a little paranoid. And of course, it made it impossible to trust Amy or be her friend at all. All in all, it made things difficult. But the last straw was when we threw a big dinner party, inviting his mom, dad, and a few important clients. She'd managed to get some kind of sedative, like Ativan or something, and slipped it into my wine. By the time dinner was over, I was slurring my words and could barely keep my eyes open. By the end of dinner, I had completely passed out and was lying headfirst in my chicken. Somehow, Amy managed to get the back of my dress wet, so it looked like I peed my pants when Trevor and another guy picked me up in their arms and dragged me into the bedroom. Are you kidding? Jason said incredulously. Not at all. It's the plain truth. We had a fight and he told me how embarrassed he was by my behavior and only got more upset when I blamed Amy. I couldn't handle the lack of support and he couldn't handle the conflict and we broke up. Gail paused, then laughed. Straight out of Disney, huh? Maybe from sick, twisted Disney. Well, anyway, that's my sad story. She paused and tilted her head to the side, scrutinizing Jason with a curious smile. How about yours? She asked softly. Jason leaned back in his chair. Well, he began, mine isn't Disney, but it looks like the movie. More like Runaway Bride, I think. Huh? Did she chicken out at the last moment? No. More like she got carried away by an old flame. Right before you were going to get married? No. Right at the wedding. I was in a tuxedo, all ready to go out, humming the wedding march. Didn't think anything could go wrong. And she walked in her wedding dress and said it was over. Said she loved another guy and that we weren't getting married. God, that's awful. Yeah, it is. Jason's incredulous smile widened slightly. I've already told you about my father. How he's a pretty rough man. Anyway, he almost caused a ruckus at church. Called her a bitch. Yelled at all the guests. It was chaos. And what did you do? What could I have done? I just walked away like some kind of zombie. He laughed briefly. I was a mess, to be honest. Just a mess. I think I think this is the first time I've laughed while telling this story, or even thinking about it. It seems so distant, like it happened to someone else. Well, time does that. Time, sure, it helps, but mostly I think the difference is you. They walked out of the bar, holding hands, walking silently down the sidewalk to the restaurant parking lot and to the car, Jason opening the door and helping Gail into the seat. He slid into the driver's seat and fiddled awkwardly with the seatbelt and ignition before turning nervously to Gail. Don't mean to be cavalier, but I had a really good time tonight and thought you might want to spend some more time together. There aren't many available right now, but we could go to my place. It's not that far from here. Gail turned away and stared out the window, saying nothing, while Jason's invitation pressed down on her like a huge, awkward weight. After a few moments, Jason broke the silence stiffly. Look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you. We haven't known each other that long, I know that. So again, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. As he spoke, Gail turned to face Jason and looked him in the eyes with a direct, searching gaze. Yes, she said simply, abruptly interrupting his apology. Yes? Yes, we haven't known each other that long, and yes, I'd like to go back to your apartment. Next chapter. 15 minutes later, Jason stood in front of his apartment door, swinging it wide open to Gail and simply announced, There she is, wishing he had offered something more witty. She entered the apartment slowly and stopped in the hallway, letting Jason take her coat as he walked past her. Come on in and sit on the couch if you want. She took 2 small steps forward and hesitated, slowly turning her head, looking around the apartment, giving the impression of cautious uncertainty. Jason continued. The kitchen is right over there, and I can get you something to drink if you'd like. And the bathroom is right down the hall if you'd like to use it. He gestured toward the bathroom, anxiously awaiting a response from Gail, who continued to stand motionless at the entrance to the living room, looking around the apartment, moving from the kitchen to the living room, from the living room to the hallway, and finally back to Jason, giving him the same tense look she'd cast at him in the car when she'd accepted his invitation. Jason, she said in a quiet but clear voice, just take me to the bedroom. Next chapter. And a really good start turned into a stormy romance, a courtship that was nothing less than sensational. Life seemed new and exciting. Their romance was so strong and intense that it extinguished all doubts and fears that could have hindered their relationship, and so they got engaged to plan a wedding as soon as possible. Like everything else in their relationship, the plans and events leading up to the wedding went flawlessly, without anxiety or resentment, and all of Jason's worries and nervousness retreated to a part of the mind that was set aside for the impossible. Everything seemed perfect, right up until the moment when Gail casually informed him that Trevor had contacted her and wanted to attend not only the wedding, but also some of the events leading up to it, and that she strongly encouraged him to come. Jason felt a lump stirring in his chest when she said that, but, trying to appear reasonable and confident, took the information as casually as possible, hoping that Gail was just trying to be polite, to be a more grown-up woman, and allow an ex who wanted to be a friend to attend an important event. But within minutes of Trevor's appearance, it was clear to Jason that he considered himself more than just a friend to Gail, and he made little effort to hide his feelings. Right from the start, he began to push Gail out of the group for private conversations, intimate conversations during which he smiled endlessly and leaned over to exchange whispers with her, ignoring the rest of the group. And when he couldn't do that, he was always there, touching her, putting a hand on her shoulder or back, nonchalantly hugging her and smirking at Jason as if she were still his girlfriend. But the worst part was that although Gail tried to push him away from time to time, she never asked him to leave or back off, never read him the law of disorder that would put an end to his borderline behavior. And now, less than 10 months after their first meeting, Jason found himself at the rehearsal for his second wedding to his second fiancée, and for the second time in his life, he experienced a sense of impending doom, because now, at this dinner, things looked worse than he could have imagined. Across the table from him sat Trevor, a confident, handsome, tanned man with salt and pepper hair and a piercing smile who was engaged in conversation with half a dozen very interested ladies, a paragon of charm and tact, the center of attraction for every eye in the room, especially Gail, who seemed unable to take her eyes off him for more than a few moments at a time. And with each sly glance, each sly smile, the lump that Gail had planted in his chest grew, becoming like an emotional cancer that darkened his mood and destroyed his composure. He haphazardly moved food from plate to plate, barely engaging in conversation with the guests, who seemed more aware of his discomfort than Gail. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he pushed his plate away and, resting his elbows on the table and massaging his temples with his knuckles, muttered quietly to himself. Gail finally turned her attention to him. God, are you okay? You look a little sore. Jason looked at her with a blank, almost threatening stare, trying to decide what to say, then leaned over and hissed in her ear, the tone of his voice so angry and foreign it hit her like a fist. Damn it, Gail, if you're going to take me down, why don't you use a knife? Gail's eyes widened in wild, startled disbelief. What? 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 What happened, Jason? What are you talking about? Jason snorted with a mocking half-smile. Come on, Gail. I've been here before. He nodded slightly in Trevor's direction. You basically invited your ex to our rehearsal without asking me. You suddenly have secrets. You're having private conversations, clearly arranging some sort of meeting or something. And now, at dinner, you can't take your eyes off him, smiling to yourself, probably about some personal fantasy. And you're nervous. I know how this ends. I've been here before. Maybe we should move it over here. Switch places? Would that make you feel better? Gail began shaking her head vigorously and leaned closer to Jason, clearly trying not to be overheard. No, Jason, you didn't. I didn't invite him. He invited himself. He said he wanted to be there. He wanted to see me. And well, I had something I wanted to do, and so I was secretive. I knew you, that you'd be mad, so I just didn't tell you. I, Angry about what? Because of some last-minute tryst? Why the hell should I be upset about what my fiancée is doing before her wedding to her ex-boyfriend and not have fun? No, Jason, no. Just stop. Her voice was suddenly low and insistent, the panic of a moment ago replaced by firm determination. Isn't, what, that, you, think? Jason raised his eyebrows expectantly, and Gail took a slow, deliberate breath through her nose before starting again. Look, if you wait a minute, just a couple minutes, I think you'll see. At that moment, one of the women Trevor was looking back at suddenly asked loudly, What's that on your teeth? That's some kind of juice. Without trying to understand what the woman was talking about, Gail smiled broadly at Jason and raised her eyebrows. Or maybe you won't have to wait at all. Jason turned around with a disgruntled face at the new commotion. What he saw seemed so strange that for a moment he had trouble making sense of what was happening. Trevor was still smiling, still sitting elegantly, but now he was bringing his hand up to his mouth with a puzzled and concerned look. His bright white teeth had somehow turned a disgusting dark blue color, as had his lips, and a small drip mark on the right side of his chin. What the hell is that? Jason asked absent-mindedly, eyes wide. What? What did you do? We're not done yet, Gail remarked carelessly, turning to him. Not finished at all. Jason watched with frozen admiration as Trevor said something briefly to the women on either side of him, then reached for his water glass, dipped a napkin in it, and wiped his mouth before taking a drink. As he drank, however, water began to drip uncontrollably from the glass onto his chin, and the blue dye that had not been completely removed spread down his neck and onto his white shirt. Reluctantly setting the glass down, Trevor raised his eyebrows in an expression of growing despair, put on an insincere smile, and gave his shirt a quick inspection before reaching for another glass that had appeared to his right. Dipping the napkin into the water again, he wiped his shirt for a few futile moments before touching the napkin to his lips and teeth, rubbing them discreetly. But a moment after he touched his lips with the napkin, his expression quickly changed from annoyed to puzzled and then to slightly upset. To confirm his thoughts, Trevor raised his glass and took a sip, whereupon his expression of frustration instantly turned to panic. His face took on a deep red color, and his eyes seemed to pop out of his eye sockets. His appearance deteriorated further when he ran his hand recklessly over his scalp, inadvertently turning his perfectly oiled hair into an ill-formed mop of black spikes. The final humiliation came when, in a desperate attempt to find relief, Trevor started to get up to run to the bathroom but found that he was somehow stuck to the chair. Unable to free himself, he grabbed the nearest knife and began desperately sawing off the spot on his pants that was clearly glued to the seat, while the polite exclamations of his table mates grew more and more intense and turned to not quite polite laughter. Finally, Trevor stood up with a tearing sound and paused briefly before rushing to the restroom. Wild hair, wild eyes, blue lips, and red face. In Jason's opinion, Trevor had gone from confidently handsome party leader to some kind of corporate clown in a matter of moments. Well-dressed, with a powerful circus act, an image that would linger in the minds of Jason and all the guests present for years to come. Oh my God, that's just really cruel. And incredibly funny, Jason said, turning to Penny, who was watching with a look of smug amusement. Oh yes, yes it is, she replied with practiced nonchalance, especially the last part. I wasn't expecting that. Jason's voice became a conspiratorial half-whisper. What do you mean you didn't expect it? That's a credit to you, isn't it? It wasn't just me. In fact, it was mostly my partner in crime. Partner? Well, yes. I needed help pulling this off, and I found the perfect person. A grown man with the heart of a 12-year-old boy. Gale nodded weakly toward the end of the table, where Jason spotted his father grinning like the Cheshire Cat. His grin grew even wider when he saw the couple looking at him, and he raised his wine glass in a toast. Oh my God, Jason said, laughing. What have I gotten myself into? I don't know, replied Gale, lowering her eyes and wrapping her arm around his. What did you get yourself into? Heaven. Heaven, I guess. Next chapter. Penny parked the pickup under a shady tree, wiped the sweat from her forehead, and cursed the broken air conditioner before climbing out of the cab. She walked slowly down the dirt concrete driveway and overgrown weedy cracks to the duplex door, passing a tiny lawn with crisp brown grass and a perpetually broken sprinkler that stood as a monument to the futility of summertime. She unlocked the door and stepped through the open front door into the living room. The fan on the crate by the couch was running at high speed, blowing air around her sleeping husband. She slammed the door shut on purpose, creating enough noise to make Kenny stir and open his eyes. Hey, baby, he said in a husky voice, running a hand through his uncombed hair. What time is it? Penny stood with her hands on her hips and surveyed the cluttered living room. An empty pizza box and an unfinished bowl of cereal on the coffee table, a game console on the floor by the couch, a pair of socks and a few folded pieces of paper. The TV was on, the intro to a video game was playing, and country-style music was playing on the radio in the kitchen. It's 4:30, Kenny, she said, and headed for the fan, leaning over to feel the breeze on her face. Did you go to your interviews today? Kenny sat up straight, stretching lazily. How was I supposed to go on interviews if you have a truck? Penny stood up again and put her hands on her hips, raising her eyebrows. I don't know. You could have looked online, filled out some forms, made some calls. It's been 7 months now, and we're really at our financial limit. Have you done anything? Anything? Kenny held his breath and let out an intermittent hiss. Yeah, I did something. I checked the net for available positions, but there was nothing but crap. Maybe if you work a shitty job for a while, it won't kill you. Maybe if you don't be a nagging bitch, it won't kill you either. Penny's face darkened for a moment, and she covered her mouth with her hands, blinking her eyes rapidly. Kenny's facial expression softened, and he quickly stood up, walked over to Penny, put his arms around her and whispered in her ear. I'm sorry, Penny. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. It's just, I don't want to take some job that doesn't pay enough. He pulled away from her a little and looked into her eyes. Just stick with me, baby. You know there's a new dealership opening up on the west side of town, and I'm eyeing a place there. We'll be fine. Just give me some time and space. Penny snorted and nodded. Okay, Kenny, okay. I'm just stressed out. My accounting job doesn't pay shit anymore, and we have no savings at all. We really need a second income. I know, Pen, I know. And I'll get it soon. Don't worry, baby. Don't worry. They gave each other a half smile and Penny kissed him on the cheek before walking over to a small alcove between the kitchen and living room where there was a desk with a computer and some filing cabinets. She sat down at the table, hovered her mouse to turn on the computer, flipped through the papers and pulled out a credit card to pay the bills. After a few minutes of punching in numbers, she pushed the papers aside and arched her back, yawned deeply, then returned to the computer to check the history. With a sense of frustration and satisfaction at the same time, she noted that the list of available jobs had one search result mixed in with sports pages and YouTube videos. She glanced at her husband, who was pulling a slice of room-temperature pizza from a box on the coffee table. "Want some?" he asked, holding out a second drooping slice. She shook her head. "No, no thanks. I was planning on going out with the girls tonight, remember?" I, yes, yeah. He nodded and chewed. "Hey, don't spend too much money," he added after he swallowed. "I won't." She gave Kenny a warm half-smile, and he gave her a toothy grin in return before returning to the important task of devouring the pizza. She watched her husband for a minute and couldn't help but think he was a boy in a man's body with his messy yellow hair, disheveled clothes, and enthusiasm for pizza. For a moment she thought he was the same boy she had met in junior high school over 20 years ago. Without thinking, she reached for the wooden box on the shelf above the table and opened it, blindly pulling out a familiar opal pendant. Taking the pendant in her hands, she stared at her husband for a while, then leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, with a dreamy, wistful expression on her face. But the smile disappeared when she heard swearing and slowly opened one eye to see Kenny struggling with the video game controller on the television. Wrinkling her nose in mild disgust, she frowned for a moment, then bit her lip and looked at the box again. In a slow, hesitant, guilty movement, she brought her free hand to the box, carefully lifted a piece of felt-covered cardboard, and pulled out a beautiful gold ring with a shining diamond. She held the ring in the palm of her hand, contemplating something, and then slipped it on her finger, secretly admiring the way it sparkled under the overhead light. Glancing around the living room, she returned to the computer and with a long, sentimental sigh, began to run her fingers over the keyboard, quickly bringing up familiar images, pages and pages of material she'd collected and saved over nearly a decade. Images pulled from social media, company announcements, and news articles. Images of Jason, him surrounded by a group of businessmen in blue suits announcing a promotion, him and his beautiful wife splashing in the waves and lying on the beach on their honeymoon in Hawaii, a family photo in front of a beautiful home with his wife, smiling father John, and an adorable baby boy with a crooked smile. The perfect house, the perfect family, the perfect life. The sound of the phone ringing brought Penny out of her reverie, and she awkwardly picked up the receiver, immediately confronted by the endlessly cheerful voice of Betsy Palmer. "Hi, how's the birthday girl 2 days late? Are you ready for the bachelorette party?" Penny thought for a moment before answering, her voice hesitant and embarrassed. "Yeah, Betsy, I don't know. I've been thinking our budget is limited and—" "Oh, no you don't. It's your birthday present from all the girls. You're not paying anything, so no excuses, okay? We'll all be there, the whole gang, except Teresa, of course." "Wait, Teresa can't come? Why?" Betsy's enthusiasm faded for a moment. Uh, I guess you haven't heard. Well, she found a second job and can't come in today. Tim's back in rehab and she has to work part-time to make ends meet, so—" "Oh, shit, I had no idea." Betsy flashed her eyes again. "Yeah, it sucks. But look, we'll deal with her some other time. We're having a blast tonight, and you better not be late or we'll miss the start of the show." "The show?" "Yeah, remember we were talking about going to the movies, and there's a new romantic comedy with Jennifer Lawrence going on. It's supposed to be really cute, but it starts at 7 o'clock, so we should have time to eat." There was a pause as Penny bit her lip in thought before replying in a reluctant and concerned tone. Is that all that's being played?" "Well, there's also a Tarantino Western, but that's pretty much the only option." Betsy highlighted the words, Tarantino's Western, with a long, sarcastic stroke, clearly expressing her disapproval. Penny snorted before replying, her voice remaining quiet and unsure. "I don't know. I think maybe I should watch a Western." Betsy's voice became incredulous and she let out a half-serious chuckle. "Really? You're kidding, aren't you? A shooter? I didn't know you liked Westerns." Penny pressed her lips together and looked at her husband, who sat cross-legged on the old rug amidst the trash and junk he'd let pile up around him, completely absorbed in his video game, furiously manipulating the controller. And then she looked at the image on the computer screen again. Jason and his perfect little family standing happily in front of their gorgeous home. When she answered, there was a deep melancholy in her voice tinged with sentimentality and regret. Betsy, it's not that. It's not that I like westerns, Penny sighed. It's that I really, really hate romantic comedies. The end. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.